So the next person to really leave a footprint in the um, personality area of study coming in from the psychodynamic approach is Alfred Adler. Okay. And I want to start out with a little story about Alfred when he was small. And little Al, when he was a child, was a very sickly child. And he missed a lot of time at school, being home in bed sick. So he suffered from a number of different illnesses, and he kind of got behind at school because of that. And also, he didn't have, he wasn't able to really develop his physical body, and because of that, be involved in sports. And he was a little boy, and he felt that that really affected his popularity at school. So kind of a sad childhood, and he's home a lot, very sickly little boy in bed. And what happened was, at one point, okay, in his grade school, the principal went to his father and suggested, kind of felt his father out on the idea of holding little Al back for a year because he was behind his classmates. And his dad went home from that meeting and talked to little Al about it. And Alfred was just horrified at the idea, okay? And the reason was he knew that he was smart, okay? And so something happened at that point in time that, as a psychologist, as an adult, and as a very famous psychologist in his own right, he's looking back at this period of time, and he realized that something that was largely unconscious, it was brought into his consciousness at that point. And once you bring something into your consciousness, you can think about it and do something about it, right? You can try to do something about it. And he decided, he begged his father and he begged the principal for another chance, not to hold him back and to give him another chance. And he made a conscious decision that he was going to actually compensate for a weak body, for not being able to develop his body, by doing something that he had left in the wayside because of his inferiority complex all along, which was develop his brain. He knew he was smart, okay, but he had let that fall too because of his inferiority complex that he had been suffering from. And once this was brought into consciousness, he said, well, wait a minute. I am going to develop my brain. And wow, did he ever do so. Because, as you know now, he became a very famous psychologist in his own right. So he was smart. And I'll tell you something. He had his friends and his family from then on, when he was homesick, bring him his textbooks, bring him many books besides that, from the library. And he not only got caught up with his classmates, but far surpassed them in his studies. Okay. So Adler calls his psychology individual psychology. That's what he called it. And he disagreed with Freud that the libido, or sexual energy, was a driving major force of the unconscious. He certainly thought it was a force. It was valid. But he felt that the most driving was something he called the need for superiority. And let's just think about that one for a minute. Because sometimes the word superiority can be a little misleading. Okay? He's not talking about the need to be the very best at anything. In fact, that is not possible. And but what he's talking about here is that everybody has a need to be better than average at something. And if you think about it, very few people ever think about this when deciding what kind of career to go into. And that's really sad, because, it's now been shown with research in support of this idea that a doctor who feels like they are just average compared to other doctors in their community actually shows significantly less life happiness, less life satisfaction, less happiness than a car mechanic who feels that he's one or she is one of the very best in town. Okay? Um, anyway, so, people have a need to feel that they are better than average, hopefully in the career and what they do for a career. And if not, they can suffer from an inferiority complex, and they could end up suffering that for the rest of their life, their adult life. Okay? That inferiority complex is largely unconscious. Remember that Adler certainly was until he had the unusual experience of having it brought into consciousness at still a young age because of the principle's suggestion. Now, again, once it's brought into consciousness, right? So the inferiority complex being is largely housed in the unconscious, so is the need to be better at average at something, largely housed in the unconscious. Okay? But if you can bring that, for instance, inferiority complex up into consciousness, these ideas up into consciousness, then you can do something about them. And that's what Adler did. And he called that process that he went through compensation. In other words, realizing where your weaknesses are, realizing where your strengths are, right? And focusing your energies and your resources and money and tuition, you might say today, on something where you're actually better than average. Okay. The next person who really left a footprint in this psychodynamic approach to personality is Erik Erikson. I don't think you can quite read this. Let me do something here. I'm just going to take this phrase and move it over where you can. That's not very helpful, is it? Okay, let me try this. If I can just pick it up and move it right up here. Okay. So, the next person who really left a footprint here is Erik Erikson. And what kind of a name is that? In other words, who is going to name their kid Erik Erikson? That's kind of redundant, isn't it? Okay. Well, you might have picked up on how it is that knowing a little bit about the background of each of these psychologists really helps us to understand where they were coming from in their theory, right? And this is also true of Erik and the story behind how he got this name. So, Erik Erikson was not born Erik Erikson. He was actually born Erich Hamburger. And his father, Dr. Hamburger, okay, who he thought was his father, was actually a stepfather. But he was raised to think that, by his mother and his stepfather, to think that Dr. Hamburger was his actual biological father. So they misled him to believe that purposely. Okay. Little Erik, really had a not a very good relationship with his father. It was very contentious. And, those things usually start developing in adolescence, right? Very young adolescence. That type of rebellion and tension in a relationship between a parent and a child. And this was the case with little Erik. And so very early on, his Dr. Hamburger really wanted Erik to follow in his footsteps and become a doctor, medical doctor. And he put a lot of pressure on Erik in this regard to prepare for this early in life. And Eric did not like this idea. Eric was totally convinced that he was a very talented painter and that he wanted to be an artist. Okay. And so what did not help this contentious relationship he had with his father was the fact that in adolescence, he also found out that Dr. Humberger was not his real dad, and that in fact his parents, his mom and his stepfather had actually purposely misled him to believe that Dr. Humberger was his biological father. So this just added to the contention. And so when Eric Erikson was a young man, somewhere around 17, 18 years old, he kind of ran away from home. He left home and he roamed around Europe for a number of years, okay, wearing a backpack with his belongings in it. And Eric really was a romantic, and he thought this is the life he wanted to live forever. It's just being free to roam wherever he wanted and just live off selling his paintings, and that was the idea. Okay? You can imagine that for a number of years, when he was trying to do this, he was not eating well, and I'll tell you that hunger can be a powerful motivator, right? So over the years, something happened. And this kind of reminds us of Elderian theory of Alfred Albert. And his idea, that you need to do something that you're better at average at. And I'll tell you something, figuring out what you're good at, what it is that you are better than average at can be kind of a bumpy road at first. It's not always easy to figure that out. And one of the ways that people often get tripped up, one of the areas that's often misinterpreted is the arts. And so we see that on American Idol all the time, right? We see people who really, really think that they can sing and they can't. And it becomes apparent in these auditions. And I'll tell you, it's really unfortunate that it has to be in such a public way, but it is very fortunate for these people if they really do accept this and come to the realization that they are not very good at this, because hopefully it will lead them into doing something where they can have true happiness in life and feel they're better than average. But Eric Erikson came to the realization that he had a really deep appreciation for painting and that he would be a true art connoisseur, but not an artist. That he wasn't talented to be an actual artist. And at the same period of time that this realization was dawning on him, something else really interesting happened, and he met Anna Freud. Anna Freud being the daughter of Freud. And so I think we talked about Anna Freud before, and the fact that Freud had taken her under his wing. This is the one of Freud's many kids that he recognized had these characteristics and skills and the intellect, the bright intellect, to become a really talented psychotherapist. And so he had taken her under his wing and he had given her the training that usually wasn't provided to women at the time. And she became a very famous psychologist in her own right. And so Erikson ran into Anna Freud, and he was super interested in psychology. And she encouraged him to pursue what you would call today, psychology undergraduate teaching, and then took him under her wing, like Freud did her, in what we would call today as a grad student. So he studied under Anna Freud and became a very famous psychologist in his own right. And it was during that time that he found what he called his true calling to psychology, that he changed his name. And he changed it to Eric Erikson. he explained that by saying he thought of himself as a self-made man. So it took him a long time to find his true identity and his true calling in life. Okay? But he did it on his own. He did it on his own terms. And he explains that last name, Erickson, as being the son of Eric. So his own son, self-made man. Eric felt that the driving force of the unconscious was identity establishment. So he felt like there is a need for a fairly stable identity, okay, to be developed at a young age in adolescence. And that follows us throughout our life. That is like the driving force of the unconscious, is to have that stable form of identity, relatively stable. Okay, and if that does not occur by the end of adolescence, that you suffer from an identity conflict. And he did, in fact, for a number of years. So he was much older than that by the time that he felt his identity was established. Okay. But he is most well known, hey, well, his identity conflict, actually, his whole theory that goes around identity was used once by an attorney in court. And this, do you recognize these individuals in the orange? This is a picture of the Washington, D.C. snipers. I believe the year was 2002. When these two men were shooting people at random. And notice that the one on the right-hand side of your screen is significantly older than the one on the left. The one on the right's name is John. The one on the left is Lee. They both had separate attorneys in court. And Lee's attorney, really accentuated to the judge and the jury the idea that Lee had no family, he had no friends outside of John, nobody influencing his identity development. And he really pressed the idea that the attorney did, that John imposed his identity on Lee. Lee had no other influences in his life. Okay? And that as a result of that, he argued that Lee should get a lesser penalty than John did. Okay? And so what do you think? Do you think that the sentence should have been harsher for John? Some of you might feel yes, some of you might feel no. Well, let me tell you what was ultimately decided in this case. In fact, Lee did get a lesser sentence. However, John got the death penalty, and Lee still got life without parole, but not the death penalty. But very interesting, to see how Erickson's whole theory built around the importance of identity development, was used in this trial. But like I said, Erickson is actually better known for something else, and that is his lifelong personality development theory. Now, Freud wasn't the only one, who thought personality development might go further than the age of 5. And Erickson wasn't the only one who thought that personality might be developed through your entire lifetime, okay? But when the methodological revolution came around, and psychologists had a way of testing these theories, Erickson's really stood out in research. There is so much research on each of these different stages that Erickson puts forth in his theory. So much research supporting the idea that truly your personality will develop your whole life long. Okay? One thing very unique about Erickson's psychosocial theory, okay, is that he identified windows of opportunity for certain things to develop in your life, in your personality during your lifetime. Certain windows of opportunity where certain things were developed. Okay? And again, this panned out with research. So remember, that Erikson's stages are psychosocial stages, unlike Freud's psychosexual stages. So Freud was talking about how you develop the foundation of your sexuality. Erikson is talking about how you develop your social self. So your social relations, how you relate to other people, and your social skills and such. Okay? And what I want you to remember with each of Erikson's stages as we walk through them now, okay, is besides the name of the stage, something versus something, is the age range and the big psychosocial question, okay? And I would also say the outcomes, except that is in the name. There are two possible outcomes, and those are included in the name of the stage, each stage. And the first one here is trust versus mistrust. Trust versus mistrust. And the age range is 0 and 1. Trust versus mistrust. This is so interesting. Any of you who have a background in a lot of research that was done after the methodological revolution, done on things like bonding, infant bonding styles, or sometimes known as infant attachment styles, know that there's a lot of research supporting this stage, as there is for each stage. But the idea here is that there is a window of opportunity, 0 and the first year, of developing this default in the personality. One window of opportunity, and it's going to follow you, that default of trust or mistrust, through the rest of your life. And the big psychosocial question at this stage is, are my basic needs being met? Now, Erikson was not claiming that infants are thinking in terms of language. Of course they're not. But what he's saying is infants get a sense of this. Are my basic needs being met? And he's talking very basic needs. So he's talking, for instance, if the infant needs liquid, is it getting liquid? If it needs nourishment, is it getting food? Is it getting that nourishment? If it needs, is the diaper being changed before some awful, serious skin disease is developed? So we're really talking basic needs here. And Erikson realized that, a caretaker can't be with the child all the time. And in fact, Erikson talked about how detrimental that would be if a caretaker could be with the infant all the time, because the infant would have difficulty trusting anybody else if that were the case. So they would never have a chance to learn this. So the idea here is the infant can't, the caretaker can't always be with the infant. So even if the caretaker takes care of the basic needs, the question then becomes, when the caretaker can't be with the infant, are they making sure that they are with somebody where their basic needs are being met? That's it. Okay. And so if the answer is yes, if what the infant senses is yes, okay, then the infant has a basic, default of trust towards other people and their personality. If the answer is no, that default is mistrust. Okay. Now, Erikson is not claiming that individuals who have this default of trust are stupid and naive and that they will trust anybody. What he's saying is that they trust you until and unless you give them a reason not to trust you. So trust is the default. And, it's also interesting to think about the other end of this, because, this tells you that people who mistrust as a default, they didn't, they learned this. This is not wrong for them. This is what they learned. And it also means that what it doesn't mean is that they will never trust you. People who have a default of mistrust, that instead, though, you have to earn their trust, okay, before they trust you. Now, And that follows you through adulthood, that default of trust or mistrust. And the second stage here, the second psychosocial stage, is called autonomy versus shame and doubt. And the age range here is 2 and 3. And this one is the big psychosocial question is, can I do things for myself? Can I do things for myself, or will I always have to rely on others? I mean, think about it. What happens if you try to tie the shoe of a 2-year-old? I'll tell you what happens, right? And many of you know the answer to this one. The 2-year-old will say, no, let me do it, right? Because they have a great need to try to develop autonomy at this age. This is the window of opportunity, the second, when they're 2 and 3 years old, to develop this idea that they can do things by themselves, that they don't always have to rely on others. And it takes a lot of patience sometimes on the part of caretakers to let them try to do it by themselves, because it may take a while before they learn it. And even when they do, it can take a long time for them to tie their shoe compared to you. So if you're ever in a major caretaker for a child, or even babysitting somebody at this age, remember this idea that, if it's not a crisis situation and there is time, that to try to be patient and let them try to do things by themselves, even if they fail. Eventually, with a lot of trying, they will get there. And so let them try. And even if it takes them a long time, unless there's a crisis, where this needs to be done very quickly. And the idea here is that we want them to develop this sense of autonomy, that they can do things by themselves, because if not, instead of carrying that into adulthood with them throughout adulthood in their personality, they will carry shame and doubt.